My name's Paul Bestall. This is Mysteries and Monsters on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Welcome to this week's Mysteries and Monsters. Well, we are into the countdown towards the Christmas holidays, but worry not, we'll still be releasing episodes as normal throughout the holidays, so you can keep that spooky going. On this week's show, we're joined by Tobias Wayland to discuss his brilliant new book, The Lake Michigan Mothman, which has just been released. Of course, the Mothman is synonymous with the events of 1966 and 1967 in and around Point Pleasant in West Virginia, most famously catalogued by the legendary John Keel in his essential book, The Mothman Prophecies. Whilst the Mothman was only a small part of the strange events that visited Point Pleasant in those 2 years, Tobias has uncovered a whole raft of sightings, primarily in and around Chicago, but also from further afield into Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Iowa, and Kentucky. We cover the resurgence in sightings, some of the witness accounts, the historical aspects, and we deal with some of those myths about Mothman's alleged appearances at natural disasters around the world. We also cover Tobias's work as a MUFON investigator. We touch on some cryptozoology, and a little bit of the paranormal, as well as some other Fortean subjects. As usual, don't forget you can follow us on Facebook. We're on Mysteries and Monsters at Twitter and Instagram. Subscribe to the channel on YouTube. And please leave us a nice review on your pod app to help us make the show grow. Now, let's find out what on earth people are seeing in and around Illinois. Today we are joined by Fortean researcher, investigator and author Tobias Wayland. Tobias started his journey into the world of the weird as a field investigator for MUFON before setting up the marvellous Singular Fortean Society with his wife Emily. This December sees the launch of his debut book, The Lake Michigan Mothman. Tobias, we are delighted to welcome you to Mysteries and Monsters. How are we?
Great, Paul. Thanks so much for having me.
No, you're very welcome. Now, I think, as I touched on it there, I spoke to Jay Bachochin the other week, who started out as a paranormal researcher and sort of found himself being pulled into the world of cryptozoology. So, for yourself, was it ufology that was your first love, or did you find yourself attracted to the Fortean world in all its various guises?
Yeah, honestly, I would say the latter, frankly. I had always been interested in sort of a holistic approach to these subjects. I think that when it came time for me as an adult to really, dip my toe into investigating myself, MUFON was an easily accessible organization that I could start out with. And so while, I've always been interested in the sort of entire breadth of Forteana, MUFON was a great way for me to get started, sort of learn the ropes of investigating how to organize and run an investigation. And then, getting some practical hands-on experience doing so, because I'm sure I don't have to tell you, and I'm really equally certain that your intrepid listeners probably don't need to hear this either. But real paranormal investigation, it isn't as exciting necessarily as people see on television, and so you really have to sort of learn by doing it. And if you love research and really, really specifically like tedious research, then boy, is this the life for you, let me tell you.
Yes, very much so. I was chatting to somebody the other week, and we were both came to the conclusion that ghost hunting can be a very boring pastime, and I think that you can apply that to all walks of the paranormal, really. That it's, we see these bite-sized segments on TV, and it simply isn't anything like that at all. It's you need plenty of coffee, a lot of patience, and a lot of dedication, I think, to just keep moving forwards when not a lot seems to be going on.
And yeah, I mean that's exactly it. Even in investigating these Lake Michigan Mothman sightings, and there've been so many of them, but a lot of the time was sort of spent researching various explanations, and you have to be willing to entertain mundane explanations too. And so I have learned so much more than I ever expected to know about the migratory patterns of large, bird species, for instance, great blue herons and black crowned night herons and just different like wetland species and things like that. And that's really interesting too. But if you got into this thinking that it was you were just going to be Doctor Who encountering different interesting alien species every week, then yeah, I mean that's it's just not going to happen. And also I realized as soon as I said this, because my wife is a big fan of that series, people out there who are fans of the series Doctor Who, I meant to say the Doctor. You won't be like the Doctor, so please don't beat me up over that. Sorry.
That's okay. There's plenty here, and obviously, it's a British institution, and something that's kind of run parallel with my entire life. Really, it's good to hear that it's still pulling in the followers and the fans around the world. So, for you, Tobias, what was it? Because this kind of explosion in the Lake Michigan area seemed to come to light about 2-3 years ago, I think, and when I'd kind of come back to basically embrace my passion for the weird and started following a few pages on Facebook and websites such as yourself and Lon Strickler, it was interesting because as someone that's a massive fan of the John Keel investigation and book, as soon as I saw the term Mothman, I thought, this is intriguing, because it just seemed to appear from nowhere. And then when you've started digging into it, and obviously Lon's done a lot of work on this as well, it was clear that there's been a complete continuation of this phenomena since the Point Pleasant incidents in 66 and 67. It's just that it didn't seem to be realised what was actually going on.
Right. Here's the thing about Mothman. You and I and anybody listening to this, is probably relatively familiar with that story, like those string of sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, from 66 to 67, which is said to have culminated sort of in the tragic collapse of the Silver Bridge in December of 1967. But most people outside of our relatively small, weird circle have never heard of Mothman. They are not familiar with the sightings. It's really never been popularized in the same way that, Bigfoot or UFOs or ghosts or anything similar, ever has. And so what I've found throughout this investigation is the more popular the articles that we write become, the more we find people who have had similar experiences, and these historical reports that had never heard of this, had never really ever expected to find somebody else who had seen something similar, and so they've been sitting on these sightings for years, sometimes decades. The oldest one we have actually is from 1969, so less than 2 years after the ostensible ending of the Point Pleasant flap. You've got something very, very similar continuing in Indiana, which is only a few hundred miles away, so not too far as the Mothman flies, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing that struck me as well, is that there seems to be and as you've touched on it, a kind of migratory aspect to this phenomenon, that it seems to be sort of fluctuating between Michigan and Indiana, as though this is its realm, as it were, trying to use that, or range. And I wasn't aware, obviously, because I'd seen the work you'd put on the Singular Fortean site, and obviously what Lon was doing on Phantoms and Monsters. So I hadn't really picked up on the fact that this seemed to be going on concurrently in both states.
Yeah, actually, so we've received reports at this time from, literally every state that borders Lake Michigan, and it's one of the Great Lakes, so it's really a freshwater sea. Honestly, it's huge, and so we've got reports from Illinois, of course, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan, and I would say that the largest distributions are in Illinois, of course, because of the Chicago sightings, and then Indiana, but they're really from every state, bordering Lake Michigan. And it is it's interesting because we can really track, and I saw this play out in real time as the investigation sort of garnered more interest. It started in Chicago, and because that's a very populated area, I think that we got a boost in public interest. And so you can watch it sort of spread out from this relatively localized area in the third largest city in the U.S. To further afield into Illinois, and then southern Wisconsin, and then Indiana, and southern Michigan, and so that was really fascinating for me to watch that play out, because it gave us a much wider perspective on this, I think, because sort of like I mentioned earlier, without the public attention that having sightings in Chicago brought, I don't know that we would have received a lot of these reports. Certainly not many of the historical ones. Like I said, most people really only came forward because they finally figured out that somebody else had ever seen anything similar to what they had, which just from a sort of sociological perspective, I think that's very interesting to me to see how, I guess, to sort of examine the medium through which people come to share these kinds of stories.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting for me is looking at this as well. There is something quite interesting about the fact that when the film The Mothman Prophecies came out at the beginning of this millennia, I think, was it 2003, 2002, something around there?
That sounds about right.
I mean, for my shame, this year it's only this year I've been able to watch the whole film, because I never got past, because I was such a big fan of the Kill book, and I saw the film and I thought, this isn't my Mothman story. I
did the same thing.
So it was finally this year my partner convinced me to actually sit down, stop being a snob, and watched the film. And once I got past that, I actually quite enjoyed it in that kind of aspect of just taking it as a piece of entertainment. So when I was obviously looking at your book and some of the witness reports, what struck me was that there didn't seem to be an explosion of reports that were around that time scale, which I know often a skeptical approach is that people are wanting to be part of something, that they're
Sure.
simply creating a false narrative, Tobias, in regards to kind of creating an exciting situation to place themselves in. And that was one of the key aspects of some of these reports, was the fact that doesn't seem to have occurred here, which for me gives it more credence. And with the greatest respect, it's not that massively popular a film. I mean, it's obviously well known to people like ourselves.
Sure.
In the wider world, it's, if you asked people to name a Richard Gere film, I doubt many average people would point to the Mothman prophecies personally.
They're not going to start with that one. No.
No.
Yeah, no. Well, like I had mentioned earlier, most of the people with whom I've spoken, like, they had never heard of Mothman before. They didn't necessarily even know that film existed. They'd never heard of the Point Pleasant sightings. And as far as any of these witnesses really being interested in being a part of something exciting, most of them don't want to be attached to this. Like, they don't really want to be a part of it. Yeah. For most of them, the sense I got was that relating their experience to me was somehow cathartic, because, well, for instance, this is sort of the general narrative of the witness experience as far as these sightings are concerned. So somebody will generally be out just sort of going about their business, doing something relatively mundane, and they will encounter this thing, whatever it is, and it's sort of a life-changing experience, because it's once you start to try to wrap your mind around it, it's somewhat paradigm shattering to experience something like a flying humanoid, especially something as sort of alien as this. And so they have this profound experience, and they will go home, and they will try to share this with a loved one, could be a partner, family member, best friend, something, and they'll get laughed at. Somebody that they trust implicitly will laugh at them, and they'll never talk about it again until they find somebody like me or Lon or any of our colleagues, and they'll find out that other people have had these experiences, and then they finally have someone with whom they can speak. That's not somebody looking for fame. That's not somebody looking for excitement. That's somebody who has experienced, honestly, in some cases, a certain level of trauma, who has had to internalize that and hasn't been able to really have any sort of meaningful release of all of this sort of like turmoil that they've kept within them for as long as they've been hanging on to this sighting. And then they finally are able to talk to somebody about it, and it's a huge relief. And then once they're done, frankly, most of them don't want anything to do with it ever again. So nobody's looking for attention. Nobody's trying to get rich or famous off of saying they had a Mothman sighting.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think that's an interesting. I think you can also use an interesting parallel, because the thing about the Lake Michigan Mothman phenomena is it reminded me, or it reminds me rather, that you can compare it with perhaps the Dogman, in the fact that what these people are reporting is so weird and so peculiar that it seems to be almost that they seem to be ashamed of coming forwards with this. And like you say, it's something that struck me when I've read some of Linda Godfrey's reports, and even perhaps listen to some of the listeners of say Monsters Among Us when they ring in with their experiences. That, like you say, there seems to be a real cathartic aspect to this, that it gives them relief, release, and perhaps allows them to finally come to terms with what they believe to have experienced, Tobias.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely it. And it's funny you mentioned Dogman as well. You know, I was having a conversation with Timothy Renner the other night, and we were talking about Mothman and Dogman specifically as two great examples of cryptids that just seemingly could have no basis in what we understand as biology. Frankly, like there's no way Mothman could fly, as far as we know. You know, like you couldn't be 6 feet tall and have an 8-foot wingspan or even a 12-foot wingspan and get off the ground. It's just not going to happen. That's not big enough. And it's the same with Dogman. Like, how could that possibly exist? But people see it, and I'm not saying that to discredit any of these witnesses. I'm just saying that, you know, people see these things and they're so obviously contrary to the materialist scientific paradigm that you're absolutely right. Like, people are embarrassed to talk about it because they feel like they are going to be shamed, and oftentimes they are, frankly. Like I had described previously, you know, like people that they really trust and care about don't even believe them. So why would they tell anybody else?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the biggest fear for anything. I think this day and age, it seems to, I think there seems to be a bit more of a sort of open arms approach in the world of Forteana, that when people find a medium for them to unload these experiences, Tobias, I think it certainly helps generate, you know, and as you refer to in the book, it's people reporting the stories to both yourselves and obviously what was with Lon as well, that once again was then generating reports of other people who were like, oh, thank God somebody else has seen this, because you know, for the, you know, with the greatest respect, I've never seen a strange flying animal you know, in the skies above Sheffield. But if I did, you wouldn't. I mean, how do you explain it? It would be very difficult to even come to terms with it on a individual level, rather than, you know, like you say, come forward in any media and sort of say, oh yeah, by the way, I've seen the giant flying things over the city. I mean, you'd be simply just putting you out there for, you know, online abuse and trolling of the highest nature, I would suspect.
Oh, of course. Well, and the thing that people have to understand too is, now you don't have to be a part of paranormal culture to understand the general narrative of the witness experience, because we've been seeing it in this country since at least the 1940s. So what used to happen, and I think we saw this sort of peter out sometime in the 1980s, I would say after, you know, Whitley Strieber wrote Communion, I think we saw less and less people doing this, but people would, you know, as good citizens, maybe call the police, and then they would be interviewed by media, and sometimes these sighting flaps would, you know, like they would be reported nationwide, and it would ruin these people's lives. It would take over their whole life, and any hope for any kind of normalcy after their sighting was just gone, and maybe their career was over, and maybe they had to move to a different town. But you know, it had these hugely negative effects on people, and you can see that historically very easily. And there are so many witnesses, like big profile witnesses, who have come out and said, you know, I wish I had never told anybody. You know, all of this attention is ruining my life. That, you know, people are familiar with that narrative. They know about it, even if they're not into paranormal stuff. And so things like this happen to them. of course they're not going to want to, put a huge spotlight on themselves and put their family through that. People who have reported these sightings to us run the gamut of socioeconomic status. So, I mean, we're talking about people of all levels of income and education, from all different walks of life, all different careers. And a lot of these people have a lot to lose. I mean, everybody has something, from the entire spectrum. But, a lot of these people have so much that they would be putting on the line if they were going to say, hey, okay, fine, here's my real name. I'm willing to be interviewed by the national media or whatever. That they're just not going to do it, because people know what happens when people do that. We've been seeing it for decades, and I think that there really was a time, sometime in the maybe mid to late 80s, where you really started seeing fewer and fewer people willing to actually come forward. I think the last big decade that had multiple on the record, high profile witness sighting cases was probably the 1970s. Honestly.
Yeah, I think you can apply that to all phenomena. You can think of quite a lot of aspects of say, lake monsters. Champ's a prime example with Sandra Manzi, who spent 40 years being called every name under the sun till she sadly passed away. And people will always kind of focus on that one image, and the general skeptical explanation for that image is it was a tree stump. However, when you look at Sandra Manzi's experience, she claims to have seen it move and look at her, and there's a whole lot more to it than just that photo. And I know there's an aspect in one of the first couple of chapters where you point to that in your reporting of these witness reports, that these eyewitnesses, it can't just be pigeonholed with an image or a particular aspect of the phenomena or what they experienced. There is often a lot more to it, that, as with any phenomenon, certain people will only focus on one particular aspect and use that explanation to just push it away.
Yeah, that's a very frustrating part of this, I think, is trying to explain to people that, look, I can't explain every sighting, obviously, because it wouldn't be unexplained phenomena if I could. But at a certain point, after looking at all of the verifiable facts, all of the data that we can actually verify, and making sure that corroborates a witness's testimony, you have to look at that testimony. And the fact is, in a lot of these cases, after speaking with them and verifying everything that I could verify, if you believe the witness, and I have literally no reason not to, then what they have seen is outside of the realm of what is currently explicable by science. It's as simple as that, really.
Yeah, I mean it is. I mean, obviously, the famous explanation for the original Mothman, and it always frustrates me when I see this, is sandhill cranes, and I just kind of think, you're not really paying attention to what the people are saying to you. And that's, especially with that, I think people got, especially obviously the main aspect of that particular phenomenon was obviously Linda Scarberry and her friends who witnessed it chasing them down, and it says, oh yeah, well, they saw a sandhill crane, what, that can travel at 80 miles an hour, firstly. Right.
We actually have sandhill cranes where I live here in Madison, Wisconsin, and that behavior for a crane is so out of place. Honestly, you almost never see them flying around. I mean, they're kind of just big dinosaurs, and they largely just, walk around on two legs, and you see them flying when it's time for them to migrate stuff, and that's about it. But beyond that, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, that was such an obvious just disregard for witnesses' testimony, and you're right. That is something that I touch on in the book, because it's something that I feel very strongly about. I mean, can we give witnesses just a little credit sometimes? Like, you don't have to try to shoehorn their testimony into, whatever pet hypothesis you want this to be. Sometimes you just have to be willing to listen to them and verify what you can, and then we're just left to speculate. And I understand that that's difficult for some people to do, but it certainly is the situation we are in. Also, I have to say, speaking of sandhill cranes, you have no idea how difficult it was for me to have to look at some of these sightings and be like, okay, some of these are probably misidentified birds, because immediately what I thought of was that sandhill crane explanation. And I was just like, oh, people are going to think I'm such a jerk for thinking that some of these are misidentified large migratory birds, but some of them are. And, I've got real strong evidence of that. Doesn't mean they all are, but we have to be willing to be, open and honest and ethical in every way we can with investigating these sightings, because if I can't, or if I'm not willing to, accept an explanation that I find, like a misidentified large migratory bird, especially when it's really, really obvious, how could anybody ever believe me when I tell them then that this other sighting doesn't have a mundane explanation? Like, it's so necessary to be willing to do that.
Yeah, and I think it's a difficult line to walk as well, Tobias, because when you're working in this field of high strangeness, it's difficult, I suspect, sometimes to pull yourself away from confirmation bias, because if you go in there with a mindset like you've just touched on, that everything is an unexplained sighting, then I think that also takes away from the actual work and the witness reports in general, because you have to have a skeptical grounding when dealing with this, because once you get through all the explanations, there will be some cases that you cannot filter out, that can't be explained with, as you touch on in here, that people are saying it's, drones are always a good one for, drones are everywhere. Kites, birds, pieces of plastic flying through the air. Yet, once you take away all those possible explanations, there will always still be cases that can't be pigeonholed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I honestly, by my estimation, maybe a little less than half of the sightings out of Chicago have the potential to be misidentified large migratory birds. And that's another thing, like, there are a few sightings, really one in particular, where I can point at hard evidence and be like, look, guys, this is clearly a bird. And the rest of them, because what we have is witness testimony, we're really just sort of left to make our own determination. I think that there are some of them that you could point at and be like, well, that's probably, like, that's most likely a large bird, but I wasn't there, and we don't have any photographic or video evidence of some of those. So really, I mean, I could have been a Mothman, I guess, but there's a certain profile of sightings that I think are probably most likely to be those misidentified large birds, and it's daylight sightings where the animal was seen flying at some distance, and it's backlit by the sun, and they they never really get that good of a look at it, and all they really see is something huge flying around. And there are, you know, a decent number of sightings like that. And one of the few bits of good video evidence that we got was that video out of the Pilsen neighborhood. And that was from a guy who was bicycling to work, and he had a GoPro camera on his helmet. And as he was bicycling to work, he noticed a couple on the street corner, and the gentleman was pointing up into the sky. And so he looked up to see what these people were looking at, and he saw what he initially described to me as either a person in a wingsuit or a giant bat or something similar. And, you know, because he had this camera on his helmet and he is a wonderful person, he decided he was going to follow this thing around and get as much footage of it as he could. And he did, God bless him, and he sent us that footage, and we were able to isolate some good still images of what he saw and blow them up, and it was a bird. I'm sorry, it's absolutely a bird. You can see the pictures yourself. If that's not a bird, I'll eat my hat. Yeah. And it just is what it is. And the thing about this witness in particular is, I mean, I talked to this guy. He worked with us every step of the way. He was relating his experience to us authentically. He believed what he had seen. He absolutely did. He was not trying to jerk our chain. He was not. And it was to the point really where after we had examined this evidence, you know, he was sort of coming to grips with the fact that, yeah, he had probably seen something like a great blue heron. I mean, that was my best guess given the profile of this thing. You know, he actually apologized, and I was like, whoa, hey, look, you didn't waste my time. You really, really helped this investigation, because now I know more than I did about what some people are seeing. Now, because of that footage, I was able to create a real profile with evidence to support the idea that some of these sightings we really don't need to look that much further into, because they are largely probably these large birds being misidentified. And because of that, we can look at what isn't the paranormal, you know, side of this, and we're able to, I think, get a better understanding of the stuff that is potentially paranormal, you know. So now we're not left going like, okay, well, why are some people seeing Mothman in the daytime and some people seeing Mothman at night, and sometimes there's red glowing eyes, but other times he's just flying around in broad daylight? Well, because those daytime sightings are probably almost universally misidentifications of large migratory birds, probably great blue herons. And that really helped us out. Like that was a huge help to us. And so when he tried to apologize, I was just like, look, no, this was so great. Thank you. You know,
it is striking, Tobias, that you mentioned herons, because obviously they're a native species in Britain as well. And I've been fortunate that where I've lived most of my life, I've often, not too common an occurrence, but I've seen herons most of my life. And what always surprises me is that the amount of people that have never seen one and are shocked by the size of them, because obviously they're you know, one of the largest birds in Europe. And I used to live between Sheffield and Chesterfield in the north of England, and where I lived, I could look across the backs of houses, and there was one particular house that had a fish pond, and once a week you would see a heron there, and you could clearly see it from 50 feet away, and it was enormous, and it was there obviously trying to get into this chap's fish pond to help itself to a little bit of a breakfast buffet, and it still surprised me that some people have never seen these birds in in the wild, even in that kind of aspect. So that for me is often telling as well, like you refer to, because a lot of people don't see these birds, so they're just completely perplexed at the size of them, I think, more than anything.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing about herons too is when they're flying, like they'll often have, depending on when you see them, like their legs might be out behind them. They tuck their head back, which gives them a really interesting silhouette if you see them backlit, which, I mean, I get why some people might be misidentifying them as giant bats, for instance, if you've never ever seen one. Because when its head is tucked back like that, and you've got this really just weird profile of this thing with huge wings, and you can't really see its head, and it's got these long legs, like, yeah, okay, I get it. Like, that's going to look weird. And you're absolutely right, too. Even people who live in areas where these things are indigenous don't always see them. In fact, and this was an interesting bit of circumstantial evidence that I had uncovered through my research, but because of things like climate change and the destruction of wetland habitats, actually there are record numbers of all types of herons that are, native to that area living in urban environments where they didn't used to. So using like Lincoln Park in Chicago as an example, this is in like the middle of the city. They went from something like, I think it was like 24 mated pairs of black-crowned night herons in, I want to say 2009 probably. And that population in that park exploded to 300 mated pairs by 2016. Coincidentally, or maybe not, just before people started reporting these weird sightings of a mysterious winged creature during the day. So, like there's something to that. And, you can get really weird with it and come up with all different types of added, paranormal, motives or origins behind that. But the fact remains, like there are way more herons in this populated urban area than there were before. And again, as you said, and it has been my experience as well, I live in a place where these things are native. At the very least, they pass through. And you don't always see them. And you can live here your whole life and only see them a handful of times. And so I don't think it's too much of a stretch to imagine somebody, seeing one of these huge birds, especially a great blue heron. These things have wingspans of up to 7 feet, and just being completely flabbergasted at what you're seeing, because frankly, at that point, they are seeing something anomalous, especially to their experience. And so I think that reaction of being surprised and of wonder in that situation is perfectly normal. And, it's great that at least these sightings were able to explain. And again, like I said before, it's great having a mundane explanation for that profile of sightings, like specifically for those daytime sightings, because now I can take them out of the equation. Now I'm not sitting here wondering, again, why is Mothman seen at night with glowing red eyes by these people, but seen at day, during the day circling the planetarium or some other huge, tourist attraction in the middle of Chicago by these other people. Well, okay, because those daytime sightings are not Mothman. It's something that people are misidentifying.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that strikes me about these reports as well is that it doesn't seem to be a one-size-fits-all, because there seems to be, if we are, with the greatest respect, if we are to take the witnesses' reports on face value, Tobias, there seems to be 3 or 4 things that people claim to see, because what strikes me in some of the witness reports that you feature in the book is the mention of the word gargoyle, which I found very interesting, primarily because that's obviously a European tradition that obviously moved across to the States as people moved there from Europe. So it's not really something that we hear very often in the modern era, because it's a medieval form of architecture in regard to the protection of a church. So those witness reports I found quite intriguing, because once again you have something there, because a couple of the witnesses report horns or protrusions coming out of the creature's head, which once again doesn't fit in with anything in the natural world.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right. I think some of this can be explained by I think the limitations of vocabulary when it comes to people trying to explain something that is completely alien to their experience. I mean, often when speaking with witnesses, people will really struggle to describe what they've seen, not because they didn't get a good look at it, or they can't picture it, but because it is so outside of their experience that really the best they can do is try to relate it to something with which they are already familiar. And so we see these things like the word gargoyle popping up time and time again. And I think that a big part of the reason for that is that, gargoyles are something that at least are known in the popular consciousness, like they are something with which people are already familiar. And so it's easier to relate this weird winged creature, whatever it is, to something that you already know, like a gargoyle. One other one that people used quite often was the monster from the movie Jeepers Creepers.
Yes.
So really, like anything that is one, a monster, and two, has bat-like membranous wings, people will latch onto that and use it to try to relate their experience, because frankly, like I said, I think that they just struggle to come up with the words to describe something so completely alien.
Yeah, it is, and there's a couple of other aspects of it that I find intriguing, and the other one that seems to strike me as well is that people seem to say, for a lot of them as well, how dark this creature seems to be. I think someone refers to it as tar black, which for an old horror movie, B-movie lover like me, instantly makes me think of the tar zombie from Return of the Living Dead. But I'm probably showing my age more than anything. But
that's one of my favorite movies. So.
Well, it's beautiful. I love them, but the first two are amazing. Anyway, yeah. This often strikes me as well, because these creatures are seen at night, yet often the reports are that it seems darker than the night, which once again seems very inexplicable, because that shouldn't apply, because it seems as if whatever they're seeing seems to be darker than a black night.
Sure, and really, what is also interesting about those descriptions is, like, for instance, in both cases that I can think of off the top of my head, which both occurred in the summer of 2010 in Rockford, Illinois, wherein the witnesses specifically used the word tar to describe how black this thing was. They actually hit it with their car headlights. So it's not just that it looks black when you're seeing it at night, because there's the absence of light. No, it's even when their car headlights hit it, it still looked that dark. And that is very interesting, because you don't see that a lot in nature. You really don't. And especially, everything about the physical description of those sort of close-up sightings are inexplicable, really. But yeah, I mean, it was those are particularly interesting, and it is something that you do see throughout these sighting reports, and it's actually part of the reason why there isn't more like minute detail given, is because I'll ask people, like, okay, well, like, did you see any other features? And it was too dark because of the color of what they were seeing. It was too difficult for them to make out, any other features, because it just kind of runs together.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, obviously you touched on it there. Dalton, I believe that it was the gentleman in Rockford, Illinois. I found that experience, and I know you mention it as well, because it was, once you get into the, as I'm sure you're very aware now, Tobias, the synchronicities will often occur, and you touch on that when you're discussing Dalton's sighting, was the fact that you essentially ended up with two witness reports from the same area, and I think you refer to it in the book that if you hadn't spoken to both witnesses, you would think they were from the same person.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It was so bizarre. Like when that second one came in, I was just, at my first gut response was to be like, this has got to be a hoax. Like what is this? Like somebody is jerking us around. But no, it just wasn't the case. Part of it, I think, could be explained because now both of those Rockford sightings were of a relatively common activity for especially teenage boys who grow up in rural areas. I mean, like, I grew up in a relatively small farming community, and I got to tell you, in the summertime, we didn't have a lot to do other than just drive around out in the country. So like that's a pretty normal thing for people to do. But yeah, I mean, like, those two sightings, both involving pairs of teenage boys out cruising around, seeing the basically exact same thing, both occurring within a very short period of time in the same summer of the same year in roughly the same area. I mean, I think there's two ways to look at that. Either it's completely synchronicitous in that it's just a bizarre coincidence, or on some level, it may actually really point to the validity of their experiences, because now, again, like I mentioned, cruising around in the country, doing burnouts and stuff, and is a pretty common activity for teenage boys around here. And you would expect, if two groups of teenagers saw the same thing, that they would describe it in a similar manner. Like, I mean, like, we're talking about people from the same area, roughly same education, background, culture, everything. You would expect them to describe it similarly, and they did. And so, once we were able to verify that these people did not know each other, and they really don't. I mean, I had spoken to Dalton again after that, of course, to verify that, this wasn't his friend who was also reporting the same experience that they had or something. And it wasn't. And, for anybody who wants to say that, like, Dalton is part of trying to hoax us or something, well, it turns out that I actually have friends in common with him. So I was able to talk to those people and be like, oh wow, like, you really know this guy. So, what am I, like, what should I be taking away from this? And they're like, look, if he said that's what's, happened, and he doesn't know this guy, then that's what happened, and he doesn't know this guy. So being able to independently sort of verify his credibility, it was astounding, frankly. And so, yeah, I mean, we're really just left with two almost mirrored reports from the same area in a relatively, a short window. And I think that really, knowing everything that I know now, really just serves to speak to the credibility of both sightings.
Absolutely. I mean, I was a little taken aback that some people might find it odd to hear stories of teenage boys just driving around, because, as you say, Tobias, the same thing happens here, because I remember when I was a young man, 17, 18, and friends had got cars, that's all we would do every night, because you're at that weird age where you're not quite an adult, but you're not really a child anymore. You're in that kind of limbo period, and it's one of the first real expressions of freedom that you can have as a young, I'm sure young women do it as well, but more often than not, groups of friends, they'll all pile in a car, everybody will throw some money in for petrol, and you'll just drive about for 4 or 5 hours, day in, day out. That's all you do for a couple of years until you discover that there are other interesting things you could be doing, shall we say. But it's not that uncommon. So I was a little bit taken aback that people would find that kind of behaviour unusual, Tobias, because for me, and as you refer to there, it's second nature when you're at that age. It's that first taste of freedom and being off the shackles of your parents and not constrained by school or college.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, I guess it would have been too optimistic for me to expect, everybody to have the same background or, be aware of that necessarily as just a totally normal thing that people do. But of course, the other part too is, and I think we, have probably touched on this quite a bit at this point, there are always going to be people who are going to be looking for literally anything at all that they can sometimes quite disingenuously point to try to discredit these sightings or poke holes in a witness's credibility and testimony and things like that. So, I think it is common enough where most people are familiar with the trope of teenagers driving around, because most of us did it. And at least some of the people who, would say that they're not, maybe they're just being obstinate.
I think that's a very polite way of putting it. Oh, I mean, it is such an interesting thing as well. Some of the other aspects as well. The witness reports that probably give me the chills more than anything are the ones where people claim to have an experience that's preceded by a weird sound that they often say sounds like a woman crying or a wailing noise, which for me, being a Brit, the first thing that comes into my mind is a banshee.
Okay, yeah.
Which I'm not saying that that's what they're experiencing, but whenever
Sure.
I hear that kind of thing, I'm not being one of those people straight away, Tobias. I'm not pitching it on them.
No, of course.
But it's a very unusual thing, because that's something that doesn't apply in the Point Pleasant cases, and it doesn't seem to happen to a lot of witnesses. But those particular incidents where people say they have this preceding noise that puts them on edge or makes them feel really uneasy because it's such a strange, peculiar oral experience, I find it gives me goosebumps.
Yeah, some of those, for instance, the one of the Calumet Park witnesses described hearing a sort of screeching noise that I think he specifically compared it to a train braking. So if you are familiar with sort of the screeching of train brakes, and that realistically could have actually been a bird call, like a heron or a crane or something, because they make a really loud screeching noise that sounds comparable to that. But on the other hand, we have sighting reports that in in no other manner point to being, anything like a large migratory bird or anything else misidentified, where people do report this screeching. And it's interesting to say the least. And you're very right in describing it as sort of chilling, because it does have the effect on these people of contributing to the deep fear that is so often elicited as a result of these sightings. And so I think that it really plays into that aspect of it, because the sighting reports that I think are the most likely to be paranormal are the ones that have that fear aspect, and often, interestingly, people will become afraid very suddenly before they even see anything, and so they'll notice the fear first, and then after that, maybe because of feeling the fear, they start looking around suddenly, and that's when they see this, humanoid, bat-winged, glowing red-eyed creature. And so, it wouldn't surprise me to find out at some point that screeching is a part of trying to elicit that fear, because that certainly seems to be the goal in a lot of these cases. And it's really one of the most common denominators across, all of the cases that I would consider, probably paranormal is that fear. And so, giving this banshee wail or shriek or screech or whatever to help people just be a little bit more afraid, it certainly ties into it, I think.
Yeah, because there is a lot of witnesses, and this is often something that you can find in a lot of cryptid sightings, especially Dogman and Bigfoot as well, where people say that their overriding emotive response to their experience is one of fear, one of dread, one of feeling as if they need to take defensive action.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the I think most striking examples that I had of this was, I'd spoken to this lady who wanted to recount her father's sighting, which she actually had a very she'd had this memory of it, basically, that she had carried with her, throughout her life, and so when she became aware of these reports, she wanted to submit, her father's on his behalf. I mean, he had since passed away. And so his sighting was back in 1976, and she was 14 at the time. And she said that, her dad had gone out after work one night to help his friend jump his car. Like his battery had died in this lot. And so her dad gets out there, and it was a full moon that night. And because of her being able to tell me a date of it, I was able to go and verify that the historical weather data matched everything that she said. And so there was, in fact, a full moon that night. And so he got out there, and he's messing around with the jumper cables, to give his friend's car a jump start. And this is a relatively isolated area, especially at this time of night, in far northern, Chicagoland. So at the far north of the sort of metro area there. And there were these tall silos nearby. And as her dad was doing this, he suddenly felt this overwhelming sense of inexplicable fear. And, as a result of this fear, he suddenly started looking around. And on top of one of those silos, he sees this creature, this thing that he described as being, probably around 6 feet tall. And he saw that it had these red eyes, and he's terrified. Of course. And his friend is also terrified. And so they don't even finish jumping his friend's car. They just grab their stuff, jump into her father's car, and they just take off. And as they do that, they hear this loud swooshing sound, and something seemed to, hit and slide across the top of her dad's car. And he just keeps going, because again, like they're in the midst of this overwhelming terror. And they're convinced that, if they stop, they could be in real physical danger. Like, that's how scared they are. And she remembers the next day that her dad was freaking out because you could see these 3 long scratches on the roof of their car. And she has that memory that she's carried with her, since 1976. But what was really, again, so interesting to me about that case, I mean, obviously all of it's very interesting. He sees the creature, it attacks their car. She saw the scratches herself. She knows her dad. She loved her dad. He was a credible guy. But beyond all of that, before he had ever seen anything, he was afraid. The fear came first. And it's not the first time that we had seen that in these sightings, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but it really seems to speak to the idea that the fear is a very important aspect to this phenomenon. Whatever the end goal is, whatever the point of it is, that fear is very, very important to it.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's as though it's the precursor to the experience. It's as though there is the emotive response before anything at all. There's no sighting, there's no noise. It's just an overwhelming sense of fear. I mean, which can occur. I'm sure anybody listening to this will be able to. We all have had situations in our life when you just get a feeling of dread come over you for no real reason.
Oh, sure. I mean, honestly, like, you can talk to, honestly, people who have seen, mountain lions out in the forest or something. Like, they'll be out hiking, and, like, the hair on the back of their neck will stick up, and, have the feeling that they're being watched, and they'll suddenly be afraid, and maybe they'll pick up their pace, and sometime later down the trail, they'll realize that they were being stalked by a mountain lion. And, so... Yeah, there is seemingly this interaction that we have almost subconsciously with our environment that alerts us to certain dangers, But, just speaking about that fear, too, and what the point of it might be, investigating these cases, I really was sort of left with no other conclusion than that we couldn't be dealing with any sort of, mundane, undiscovered animal. I just couldn't ever reconcile the idea that there is a breeding population of Mothmen out there who are built, seemingly in defiance of all biology and physics flying around. And so, I had to consider other explanations. And, given, some of the differences in description and some of the concurrent phenomena that people experience that could even be considered psychic, or some of it could even, sometimes replicate like the phenomena of hauntings, things like that. Considering the existence of that, like, I had to consider, what if we were dealing with something that really interacted with us through the level of human consciousness? And so, given that sort of immaterial, aspect, I mean, what if it, really just was native to that, like to that level of existence, really? I mean, what would something that thrived in this ecosystem of consciousness. Like what would it consume? Well, maybe it consumes emotions, maybe it consumes fear. And of course that's all speculation, but I mean those are the kinds of roads that this investigation has really led me down, just I guess to give people an idea of how weird and how startlingly bizarre really these sighting reports are.
Yeah, I mean it is perplexing because, like you say, there is such a wide variety in some of the reports that they clearly aren't seeing the same things, but there is still that kernel of experience that tends to suggest that there are certain people that are clearly seeing the same thing in very different areas, because they all seem to have the same kind of facets to each particular individual's report, for me, Tobias.
Yeah, I mean there's enough commonality between the vast majority of these reports, and I guess when I say that I mean specifically the different types of reports. So there's enough commonality between, say, the misidentified large bird reports, and there's enough commonality between the potentially paranormal reports for me to believe that there are, there is a common phenomenon that is the origin of both, respectively, and so, speaking to the paranormal ones, the vast majority of people do report something very, very similar in appearance, barring different discrepancies that I think are probably often more related to the normal variance that we would see in witness perspectives than actually, really describing any real stark difference. And so, yeah, I mean, the majority of people do describe the bat-like humanoid with the glowing red eyes. Sometimes they're described as orange. We've even had people describe them as green. But in the cases where they're described as green, oftentimes is when you'll see the largest variation in description. The one example that comes quickest to mind here is in Woodstock, Illinois. We had sort of a mini flap, more of a flutter, really, that took place. Yeah, you can use that if you want.
Absolutely, that's a good play on words. Excellent.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
That was in early 2019, and the witnesses in those reports were actually describing something that looked more like, for lack of a better term, really a Bigfoot with large, leathery, membranous wings. And so those really didn't match anything anybody else had been describing up until that point, other than the large, bat wings, basically. And so, at that point, we have to ask ourselves, well, is this the same thing? Is this something completely different? And I don't really know, honestly. I think that, if we are sort of dealing with things that seem to be interacting with us in a way that is somehow bafflingly at once physical and immaterial, then, we may have to allow for the idea that this difference in description, while, yes, some of it is just the normal variance of which I spoke earlier, some of it could be that the being itself is either capable of appearing in any number of different variations, or if its appearance itself even really only sort of fits a general theme, and then the rest of that is sort of filled in by the observer in some way, whether that's by their expectations or cultural norms or something like that, just sort of informing the experience and just sort of molding it, so it's almost unique to that person. And the more I think about that, like the more it almost seems to make sense with, those cases where people describe it as being almost completely black, so tar black that they can't even make out features. Well, maybe those people really didn't have anything in their experience to fill in those blanks. And so when they're dealing with this thing on the level of consciousness, and it's sort of dependent on them to mold its appearance, they're left with this void, more or less. So I don't know. There's so many weird paths we can take here, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, when I speak to anybody, especially when you've basically put your hat on a phenomenon such as this, Tobias, how has it affected you and your understanding of the world around you?
Well, honestly, I think that the greatest effect that this investigation has really had on me, in the sort of mundane aspect, is this was a big learning experience for me as far as how the paranormal as an industry can operate, and some of the unfortunate aspects of that. But from a paranormal perspective, it was striking to me to speak to so many people who had so many baffling experiences that had such a profound impact on their life, and you can't ignore that. And so I think that something that might be difficult for people to understand, who are reading this in a book or seeing articles online, is that every one of these stories represents a real human being who had an experience that has profoundly changed their life that they can't explain. And just sort of sitting here and letting the enormity of that wash over me, it literally gives me chills. And I think that that's probably the greatest effect that this has had on me, is sort of just confirming my suspicion that these kinds of events, they're not as special, I think, as we'd like to think, because it certainly seems to just happen to, or could potentially happen to almost anybody.
Yeah, I think it is as well, because it's one of those aspects that for a lot of these people, it has changed their life, and probably not for the better.
Certainly, yeah. I don't know that any of the witnesses with whom I spoke would, if they could go back and change, seeing this thing, I don't know that any of them would choose to see it.
Yeah, very much. I've spoken to a few people who, when they've spoken to people who have alleged to have UFO experiences or seeing Bigfoot, that for some of those people, they tend to take a real. It's like that something changes in their mindset, and they. I remember speaking to Dr. Lynn Keatai, who's obviously synonymous with the Phoenix Lights phenomenon, and she was saying that the majority of witnesses she spoke to in that underwent some kind of outlook change in the way that they viewed their place in the world and the universe, and how they viewed the world around them in a more positive impact. They became more interested in environmental issues and the well-being of their fellow mankind. And I've always found that interesting. But as I say, when I read your book, the one thing that struck me consistently, I think, from the majority of the people that seem to be seeing the same thing, was that they just can't comprehend it. They can't decompartmentalize what's happened to them. They can't put it away in a box and think, oh, that's what it was. And I think that's a very striking aspect of the majority of witnesses you've spoken to and include in your fantastic book, Tobias. So it resonates with me because of that kind of negative response that these people seem to take from it, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, and honestly, it has had a somewhat negative effect, I think, on most witnesses. And again, when I say that, I mean I mean the people who are in the category of paranormal witness. Honestly, one of the other difficult aspects of getting people to speak about this that I had seen over and over again too was the idea that kept cropping up among witnesses that speaking about it would somehow summon the phenomenon back into their life, which was kind of a weird idea to me, because that's not something that I had heard a lot before. Like, that's not really something that had cropped up. Like, it wasn't completely unheard of, but it wasn't something that had cropped up in any other in investigatory area as often as it did in these sightings. I mean, people were literally afraid to speak of their sighting, and certainly if they had already spoken, of it once, they didn't want to do it again, because that one relating of it to you was enough, because they really thought and were terrified of somehow allowing this back into their life. Like, that's how negatively some of them were affected by what they had seen.
Yeah, it is interesting, and like you say, there's that kind of that they're scared to talk about it, like you say, because it's almost as if it will summon it back. And that was also very striking, because that would sense that it's almost as if their experience was, in some aspects, they'd caused it, which I found a perplexing way of rationalizing what had happened to them.
Yeah, well, I think that what that spoke to me the most was people sort of struggling to have some kind of agency in their experience. Like, they couldn't control that initial encounter, but they could control trying to put it away, trying to make sure that they didn't experience it again. And so I don't know if that sort of speaks to the general feeling of powerlessness and lack of agency that people experienced in these encounters, but it certainly seemed to for me.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to once again congratulate you, because I think it's a phenomenal book. The level of research. I mean, the thing that struck me, and I know you mentioned it earlier when we were talking about Neferhepri's father's sighting, is the fact that you checked the weather reports. You checked the waxing and waning of the moon in some of these reports to try and that I all credit to you, Tobias, because it's very easy, I think, sometimes, especially in this field, and I'll not point any examples, but it's clear that sometimes people will just accept everything on face value and say, there you are, that's what's happened. Whereas you kind of said, right, well, they said this, so when could it have happened? And that particular story, because she'd said it had happened prior to her birthday, and the timescale and the location and everything, you were able to calculate near enough the exact time and date of that particular experience, which is all credit to your qualities as a researcher and an investigator, and also the fact that a lot of these experiences aren't too far away from you, so you're able to get out there and get boots on the ground, investigate the area, do a recon and get everything lined up in your own mind in regards to how the area looks and the foliage and what the traffic's like and that type of thing, and then that's all power to you, I think.
Well, thank you very much. I it means a lot to me that is appreciated, because I agree with you that it is unfortunately lacking, especially in the internet age, where anybody can post anonymously online and it will be shared ad infinitum, and just taken at face value with absolutely no research done. And I think that, to me, because of why I got into this in the first place, and because of how powerful these experiences are to witnesses, I take it very personally, and it's very important to me to do credit to the people whose lives have been deeply affected by this. And I think that the only way to do that is, again, to be completely open, honest, and ethical with how these things are researched and investigated. And so, yeah, you just have to. You have to corroborate everything you can. You have to be able to verify data. There's no such thing as too much data. Really.
Yeah.
So, you have to get out there if you can. You have to take pictures. You have to have as much communication with the witness as they are willing to have with you. And if you can't do that, then I don't think that you're covering these things with the amount of respect that they deserve, and frankly, the amount of respect that the real witnesses who have really experienced something deserve.
Yeah, and I think the final point I'll touch on before I pick your brains about some of your other work, Tobias, is the fact that I was really pleased to see in the opening chapters you speak to Lauren Coleman, because there's one thing about this Mothman that really annoys me, and this is exactly kind of refers to the point you've just made, is how many people have now claimed that, oh yeah, somebody saw a Mothman on the Silver Bridge when it collapsed. There's no evidence that anybody reported anything at the time. It's all anecdotal and after.
Right.
And that seems to have... I was listening to something the other week, and it was touched on that, oh yeah, people have always seen it, it happened at Chernobyl and Fukushima and places like that. And I'm thinking, no, it's not at all. It never gets reported at the time. It's always 12 months later. And a lot of that, and I think Lauren points to it, occurred after the Mothman film came out. So if it's affected it negatively in that aspect, it's that we've now created a whole... I'm trying to think of the right word without being too harsh. There's basically like a false narrative about the Mothman that's been bolted on to justify certain websites and certain YouTube channels that claim, if we were to believe many of these people, Mothman's seen at every single disaster, yet nobody goes, oh, hang on a minute, I think something bad's going to happen here, because nobody seems to be able to get these places evacuated before something terrible happens.
Right. If Mothman is supposed to be some sort of harbinger of disaster, he's terrible at it, because he has yet to prevent a single one.
Yeah, people just don't pay attention.
I guess not. And even going all the way back to Point Pleasant, I was a huge fan of John Keel growing up. He really helped shape me as an investigator. He was one of the guys that I grew up reading who'd made me want to write books like this, frankly. But you can go back to the Mothman prophecies and read it again. And especially reading it now, I have no idea why anybody connects the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant to the collapse of the Silver Bridge, other than, if there's one thing people love, it is a tidy narrative with a neat ending that just wraps everything up very, very, very nicely. And so I think people were willing to suspend an enormous amount of disbelief just to have some kind of neat ending, just to be able to add some kind of sense to this senseless tragedy, And the fact is, there's really nothing to support that, other than our own predilection towards wanting that to exist. But real life doesn't have tidy narratives. Real life doesn't have neat, convenient endings, and neither does the Mothman. It just is what it is.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that's a good place to park up the Mothman and your book. I think you've just got to basically take it as it is, and why elaborate something as peculiar as this anyway? It doesn't need anything else adding to the mixture.
It's weird enough.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, congratulations once again, Tobias. It's a fantastic book. I recommend it highly. And with Christmas around the corner, I would suggest anybody listening who's looking for a gift for the weird lover in their lives, I would recommend this as a brilliant stocking filler and a great way to spend a few evenings diving into the case. So congratulations to you, and obviously the fantastic artwork as well that adorns the cover by your wife as well. Superb, brilliant. Well done to both of you.
Thank you very much. I'm so proud of her, honestly. Like, I think I mentioned this in the dedication even. Like, Emily is literally the reason that I am not ranting about these subjects in green text on a black background somewhere in the internet. I mean, it is her design and artistic ability that has allowed me to reach the kind of audience that we have. And so, I mean, I love her to death, of course, but her talent is it's impressive, and I am immensely proud of it.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, I mean, that leads us nicely on to cover some of the aspects of the pair of yours work, and obviously the Singular Fortean is one of my go-to sites. So, as you refer to, what was it just that obviously after you'd finished doing the MUFON investigations, you fancied sort of fixing your gaze on a wider level of Fortean phenomena, Tobias, rather than, not that I'm suggesting you were perhaps pigeonholed or restricted by just working in the UFO field, and was it just that it just gave you more of a sort of tablet to express your love of weirder things?
Well, there was a pretty sizable gap, actually, between me, a pretty sizable gap in time between me leaving MUFON and Emily and I starting the Singular Fortean Society. And I sort of left MUFON for my own reasons and a certain level of dissatisfaction that I had within that organization. But that isn't necessarily the topic at hand, so I won't get too much into it. But I had just sort of investigated independently, really, for years, without much direction, honestly. And so when I met Emily, I still remember on our first date, I told her sort of what my interests were, and like right away she was just like, "Oh, have you heard of this thing?" And it was some lights up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that I'd never heard of, and there were these relatively famous ghost lights, and I was like, well, there has to be a second date now, introduce me to a new paranormal phenomenon. Yeah. And so yeah, I mean, like, we had been together for a little amount of time after that, because of course we hit it off. It was the proverbial love at first sight, and we realized that we sort of had these complementary skill sets. I was an English major. That's my degree, and she has degrees in design and photography. And so we're like, well, we can do something with these, right? And so we had talked about it, and we had noticed, at least to our minds, that there was a gap in how the paranormal was presented to people. And we couldn't, and this is something that has bothered me for some time, just personally, but there didn't seem to be enough people reporting on these subjects journalistically. Writing paranormal news for an audience that can be assumed to have some knowledge of these subjects. Writing the news for people who take the paranormal seriously. And so that's been our main emphasis. We do a lot of news articles, and you'll notice when I'm writing news articles, it's in a journalistic format. I try to stick to facts. I will provide a frame, to try to really enhance the reader's perspective. Really be able to accurately relate a piece of news to them. But I really try to stick to facts, even if the only facts I have are this person said this thing happened to them. But then, if you read the book, for instance, that's much more editorial, where, I'm really allowed to just go off leash and present my opinion and findings, as far as the evidence and testimony and things. And you'll see some of that too. We also do like feature articles, and so oftentimes those will be about a personal experience we've had, or an investigation we've conducted, and so that'll tell our personal perception and our personal perspective, and then perception of events as they transpire. We also do like some more fun things, like we have a blog on the website, and this always is a little irritating to me, is sometimes people will refer to the Singular Fortean Society as a blog, and I'm like, look. A blog is a series of journal entries, like online journal entries. It's opinion. It's written in that sort of diary style, and we have a blog, but we are not a blog, because you can't tell the news objectively in a blog. That's not what blogs are. So we also do have a blog on there. So like we'll have more editorial content in that. Say we have an opinion that we want to share on something, or we'll have guest blogs from other people every blue moon, or we'll do like monster profiles. Those are always fun, and so often that'll be a mixture of maybe and we do try to research those well. So it might be the Flatwoods monster, where we've gone back and looked at what newspapers from the 1950s were saying about it, and try to put together as clear of a picture as we can of what people were saying at the time, without all of the folkloric expansion that's happened to the story since. Or it might be something that exists entirely in legend, like the furry trout, or some other, like basic, just like lumberjack tale, like we love all of that stuff. And so we'll present it all. It's not all equally true, as far as is concerned, but we do find value in all of it. So we wear many hats, but it says right in the title Fortean. So I would hope people would expect that. That is the one thing I have to explain the most often to people, though, is what Fortean means, because a lot of people aren't aware of Charles Fort, although in my opinion he is arguably the most influential boy, that was very redundant. He is arguably the most influential person in the paranormal of the entire 20th century. Everybody from John Keel to Lauren Coleman to Jacques Vallée are influenced by Charles Fort and his holistic view of paranormal phenomena. And so that's why we included the word Fortean, and that's sort of the approach we take. Like you can't just cover one aspect of the paranormal, especially not if you want to be a paranormal news agency. You know, you can't just do ghosts, because the Venn diagram of, you know, ghosts and cryptids and UFOs, it's a circle. I mean, they have so much in common. So yeah, I just don't think you can ignore that, and so we don't. And I think it's worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good catch-all term, you know, as someone that actually is a member of the Centre for Fortean Zoology in the UK. You know, my interests cover the whole gamut of weird. You know, from strange things falling from the sky to Bigfoot to ghosts to, you know, anomalous phenomenon, things like Mothman, poltergeists. I just love it all. So I'm not into cryptozoology. I'm not into the paranormal. I love it all. I find it all as equally fascinating. Though there are certain things I'm more passionate about or more interested in. Yet, you know, I've read the Fortean Times for the best part of 30 years. You know, I've watched everything that's ever been released on TV, from Arthur C. Clarke to Monster Quest to, you know, sitting through 100 episodes of Finding Bigfoot. So, you know, I've put myself into many things. So I completely understand where you're coming from there, Tobias, because that's the hat that fits me best, as I suspect it is for you and Emily.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, the other thing I'd like to touch on before I let you go today is obviously I was delighted to see that you'd gone out Bigfoot hunting with a couple of mutual friends. Obviously, I've been fortunate enough to have both Jay Bachochin and Adam Benedict on the show. And delightful gentlemen they are both. So it's really nice when I see people getting together who I've got a lot of respect for, such as yourself and Adam and Jay, and obviously Emily. So it was good to see you out there. So how was that?
Well, it was great. You know, we've been friends with both of those guys for some time now. And we had been out in the Kettle Moraine State Forest with just us and Jay before. And, you know, it's a weird place. Every time we've been out there, there's been something that's happened that you know, I certainly couldn't explain, you know. And then, you know, having Adam out there was a lot of fun. I mean, frankly, it was great because, you know, Adam especially is one of those guys. He's very level-headed, and he takes a very skeptical, but open-minded approach to these subjects. And so, to be able to be out in the field with him while he's experiencing things that, you know, sort of confront his skepticism, and watching that play out in real time, it was really, really interesting, obviously. And I'm not going to speak for him, you know, on that, but I know that we all saw things that we couldn't explain. And, you know, it's one thing to do the research. It's one thing to read the books, you know, and all that stuff, but it's a whole nother animal when, you know, you're out in the forest and it's pitch black out there and there's no natural light, you know, or I'm sorry, there's no, you know, man-made light. You've got the light of the moon, and that's it. And whatever you brought with you, you know, flashlights and such. And, you know, you're experiencing something that there's no convenient explanation for. It's difficult to describe. I mean, I've certainly tried more than once. I know I've got quite a few features written about those types of experiences we've had, but it's always fun, particularly fun for me to go out with somebody that I haven't before, and somebody who gets to experience that stuff as it's happening. You know, and I think part of that is a little selfish because on some level when other people are experiencing it too, all of a sudden, like that allows you to go, okay, well, look, I'm not crazy, because if I am, then you are.
Yeah, the more people that are there, the better it makes us all feel, I think.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Oh, well, fantastic. I look forward to seeing some more of your late night adventures out there with Jay and the gang. So, yeah, I'll keep my eye on that. So, before I let you go then, Tobias, like I say, thank you once again for your time and your conversation today. Where can everybody keep up to date, get the book from, and follow you and Emily's work online?
Sure. So if you're interested in the Singular Fortean Society, you can find our website at singularfortean.com. We are on every social media platform of which I am aware. So you can find the Singular Fortean Society on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. As far as the book is concerned, you can find that on Amazon. There's a link to it on our website. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's easy enough to type just Lake Michigan Mothman into the Amazon search bar. You can find it that way. If you're interested enough in what we do to want to be a part of it, then I encourage you to join the Singular Fortean Society, and you can do that either through the link on our website, or you can go right to patreon.com/singularfortean.
Brilliant. And I recommend all your channels as essential for anybody with a love of the weird. Like I say, it's always been a go-to site for me as long as I've been aware of it, and it's a fantastic resource for anybody who loves the weird like us. So, Tobias, thank you so much for your time, and the very best of luck with the book. I hope it flies out the shelves for you. So, congratulations and good luck.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And before you go, I wish you, Emily, and your wonderful menagerie of pets a very happy Christmas as well.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.